Thank you for the introduction. Really grateful to be with you all. I've been really grateful for your pastors for various reasons. They've become friends over the last couple of years, and so I've been really grateful for them. And I've gotten to spend some time in the Crossbridge orbit, but never on a Sunday. So it's really great to be here with you on a Sunday. Very grateful for the time. Let me read for you our passage, which is going to be coming from Ecclesiastes 1. If you want to follow along with the paper Bible that's in front of you, it's on page 950. Let me read this for us. I'll pray, and then we will jump in. Ecclesiastes 1, starting in verse 12. It says, I, the teacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. I applied my mind to study and to explore by wisdom all that is done under the heavens. What a heavy burden God has laid on mankind. I have seen all the things that are done under the sun. All of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind. What is crooked cannot be straightened. What is lacking cannot be counted. I said to myself, look, I have increased in wisdom more than anyone who has ruled over Jerusalem before me. I have experienced much of wisdom and of knowledge. Then I applied my mind to understand wisdom and to understand madness and folly. But I learned that this, too, is a chasing after the wind. For with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. This is God's word. Let me pray for us. Father, we thank you that you are a God who speaks. And we thank you that the way that you primarily communicate to us is through your word. And so I thank you for this passage here in Ecclesiastes 1. And Lord, as we take the next few moments to consider what it is that you're communicating to us, I pray that by your Spirit, you would make it come alive to us in profound ways, that you would accomplish that which you desire to accomplish for your people through your word. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Let me start maybe by framing our time together this way. There's a real cognitive dissonance, I think, that tends to exist amongst us, and that's really this, that we often think more highly of ourselves than we should. That often we don't actually have a really firm and foundational understanding of who we are. That too often we are really missing opportunities for growth in our lives because often we just don't have a proper view of ourselves. One fascinating but also kind of comical example that I've witnessed over the years, and maybe some of you would resonate with this. If you were to base solely on what people think about themselves, what they say about themselves, you would assume that things like racism, bigotry, xenophobia, greed, arrogance don't exist. And the reason why is because no one ever admits to being a racist or a bigot or a xenophobe or arrogant or greedy. Meaning, because we don't tend to see ourselves that way, one could assume, well, those things don't exist. But of course we know that's not the case. We know that such things exist, but people just don't have a proper view of themselves. And of course, if you were to actually make people aware of their racism or bigotry or arrogance or greed, they clutch their pearls, horrified at such an insinuation, that you would accuse them of such things, and yet such things persist. But another issue, another reality that is also very prevalent, and yet it never seems like anyone actually admits to having the problem, is the problem of foolishness. No one wants to view themselves as a fool. No one thinks of themselves as being a fool. I mean, we want to be people who are not foolish, but that are people of wisdom. We want to be people that are known for making good decisions, being people that are able to see life rightly and live proper lives. And yet, it's still the case that though we might not want to think about ourselves as foolish, we nonetheless can be fools. And I actually think this passage highlights that. It's also fun to be the guest preacher that gets to come from out of town to your local congregation here and call us all fools together. Thank your pastors for giving me that opportunity. But what I think this passage does for us is it actually confronts us with notions of wisdom, which actually does produce, I think, opportunities for us to really grow out of foolishness and into wisdom if we have ears to hear. What does it mean to resist being foolish and instead be people of wisdom. Now today we're, of course, continuing on this series that was started last week, looking at the book of Ecclesiastes. And again, today we're going to be taking a look at the realities of wisdom and to be confronted by wisdom, but also to consider the limitations of the wisdom that we might pursue and how those limitations actually drive us towards something that is ultimately our ultimate hope. And so to consider all of that, let's consider three things together. First, let's consider the pursuit of wisdom. Second, we'll consider the limits of wisdom. And then third, we'll take a look at the person of wisdom. Right? So first, the pursuit of wisdom. So to begin, since this is still early in the series, let me just recap for you where we are right now. Last week, if you were here, you were introduced to a man known as the teacher. And the teacher is the one who wrote Ecclesiastes, and the teacher is presenting some rather jarring and yet very honest realities of life. Specifically, that everything about life, according to the teacher, is meaningless. In verse 2, earlier in the chapter, he says, everything is meaningless, utterly meaningless. Other translations say that everything is vanity. Everything is futile. Everything is nonsense. Now, the Hebrew word there that's being translated into English as meaningless, it's the word hevel. And hevel is actually a rather difficult Hebrew word to translate because it literally means vapor or smoke or breath. And verse 14 of our passage, I think gets at the real sense of it, that it's like chasing the wind. It's like trying to grab onto smoke. You know, to chase after meaning in life is hevel. It's like grasping at smoke. It's purposeless. There's really no chance of success. And specifically for us today, the pursuit of wisdom is like chasing the wind, grasping at smoke. But in order to wrestle with that reality and the tensions that it provides, I do think we first need to consider what we mean by wisdom. What is wisdom? Well, in Hebrew, in the Old Testament, the word wisdom is not primarily philosophical notions. Instead, the idea of wisdom in the Jewish mind of the Old Testament was oriented toward action and the proper management of life. And then you fast forward in the New Testament, and I'm thinking about places like James 3. There you have the Greek word for wisdom is the word sophos, which is where we get the word sophisticated. And it was a word that described a high development, a high degree of complexity, developing a high degree of complexity in our thinking and the way that we approach life. In other words, wisdom is the ability to understand the complexities of life and to apply whatever knowledge that we have rightly to our lives. Wisdom describes the ability to see the interconnectedness of life, and as a result, be able to build something, create something beautiful in life. And so it's not just knowledge, but it's the ability to see how that knowledge connects and applies. It's ultimately about complexifying our thinking. That's wisdom. So to give an example, as you just heard, I am a musician, songwriter, guitar player, and I absolutely love hardcore metal. If you ever want to join me in a sweaty mosh pit, Carter and I would love to host one for you. We'd happy to do it. Actually, when I think about too, that's like mosh pits are like my favorite. It's just the best. When I think about, in the book of Revelation, when there's every tribe, nation, and tongue, there's that worship service around the throne. I imagine that being a mosh pit. That sounds like my glory. That would be amazing. So yes, I have spent years writing and recording and playing that kind of music. And one of the things as a musician, as a guitar player, and maybe musicians or guitar players in the room, or maybe you know someone, maybe this will resonate with you. One of the key features of a lot of guitarists are guitar solos, right? Guitar solos matter a lot to guitarists. But the question is always this: what makes a good guitar solo? Well, there are some, and I've known them over the years, some guitarists who are insanely proficient metal guitar shredders. If you don't know who these people are, if you ever go to like a guitar center, they're the ones sitting in the corner by themselves with a guitar just going crazy on some wild, Eddie Van Halen kind of riffs or something, right? Incredibly skillful in being able to shred. But with all of that knowledge and all of that ability, I have known some that if you were to then take them out of Guitar Center and put them in a band with other people and ask them to take that music that they play and integrate it into the music that's being played by others. If you ask them to weave themselves and see the connections that exist as they're playing with other people, they struggle to do so. And as a result, they end up being the metal shredding guitarist playing some crazy shredding riff over some soulful jazz. It doesn't produce anything beautiful because they're too simplistic in their thinking. They lack the ability to see the complexity and how various things can work together to create something beautiful. Another example that I find to be very prevalent is just how education tends to function and how we think about education. You might have someone with all the degrees, right? They have all the knowledge, they have all the achievements, but then you ask them to step into the real world, and they struggle to take all of that knowledge and bring it into the real world and apply it rightly because they aren't wise. The knowledge itself doesn't make them wise. They don't see the connections in life. They might have a vast array of information, but they lack the ability to see the complexity of how that information applies in everyday life. And this is actually, I think, one of the major problems that we have right now when it comes to our modern culture war debates. If you pay attention to some of these debates, you have smart people with lots of information, lots of knowledge, but in their arguing, as they argue for their positions, even though they seem to have a lot of knowledge, they reveal a simplicity in their thinking. Name a topic, whatever the topic might be. You can find someone who can argue for their position, and they can do it well, but then they have no interest in learning about how other people come with different perspectives, and that maybe those different perspectives might actually complexify their thinking so that something can actually be built and created, something that is beautiful, that is dependent on the complexity. The point is simply this: wisdom is in the complexity. It's not about simplistic thinking. And we also know that, in an age where we care more about tweetable arguments or viral clips, simplicity does tend to rule the day. And that simplicity, bottom line, makes us foolish. And it creates the culture wars that we find ourselves in today, and ultimately, it doesn't create something beautiful. In the end, that foolishness is actually very destructive. It ends up just being metal guitar shredding over soulful jazz. If we want to build something beautiful, to see the interconnectedness of life, to be people who make good decisions and approach life rightly, we need to be people of wisdom, not people of foolishness. But that said, what does the teacher then tell us about this pursuit of wisdom? Right? We've just said wisdom produces beauty in life. Foolishness is destructive. Wisdom produces beauty. So what does the teacher of Ecclesiastes 1 want us to know about that pursuit? Is it a worthy pursuit? According to Ecclesiastes 1, according to the teacher, no. According to him, it's just a waste of time. It's hevel. And the reason is because of the limits of wisdom. Let's look at what I mean by that. Look at what he says in verse 12. He says, I, the teacher, was king over Israel and Jerusalem. Let me just pause there for a second. So many have argued that the book of Ecclesiastes was written by King Solomon, who famously is known as the wisest man who's ever lived. And so if that's the case, right, if that is who the teacher is, his next words are quite striking. Verse 13, he goes on to say, I applied my mind to study and to explore by wisdom all that is done under the heavens. I have seen all the things that are done under the sun. In other words, King Solomon, if this is who we're talking about here, he's given his life to learning and attempting to understand the complexity and the interconnectedness of life. That he's committed himself to growing in wisdom. But then he says, In all my study, in all my exploration, it's all been hevel. Look at verse 14. He goes on to say that all of this pursuit has been meaningless, a chasing after the wind. What is crooked cannot be straightened. What is lacking cannot be counted. I mean, why is he so glib? Why is he so down on this pursuit of wisdom? Well, look at verse 18. I find this to be an incredibly insightful statement. He says, "For with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief." In other words, the more I have learned, the more sorrow I have experienced. The more I've understood the complexity and interconnectedness of life, the more discouraged I have become. Why is that the case? Well, think about it this way. So in addition to being a pastor, I am also in the academic world. And something that I have, and as a result of that, I've known a lot of people with PhDs. And at least in our culture, that we view people with PhDs as being like the smartest people, right? That's kind of a cultural thing for us. But here's what I have found about good PhD academic researchers. There are good ones and there are not so great ones. But the good ones, here's what I've found. One of the defining characteristics of a good PhD researcher is that though they are an expert in their particular field, and they are, right? Whatever the field might be, you want to know what they have to say because they spent a lot of time on it. So they are an expert in their particular field. But a good researcher not only recognizes what they know about their field, a really good researcher is also an expert in how little they know about the topic. It's a bit of a paradox. They're both an expert in what they know, but they're also an expert in what they don't know. Why? Because they know just how deep that topic goes. They're experts in how complex an issue might be. You know, in my own field of study, I research a lot of issues related to justice and race and social ethics and economics, primarily issues of poverty and theological responses to it. Now, everything I just said, as you can imagine, people have some strong opinions about issues of justice and race and social ethics and the like. And something I have found to be interesting over the years, as I have spent time studying these issues, this is maybe a little bit of a side note, but I have found that those who are most confident about their position, or those who want to tell me why I'm wrong, or that I'm a Marxist, or whatever people want to say about me, those who are most confident tend to be people whose confidence is rooted in a Reddit thread they read once, or a Facebook post, or some podcast that they heard. It makes them very confident in their position, whatever that might be, right? And so when I hear that, when I experience that, I can think, okay, I realize maybe I have an expertise in some of these areas because I've done a lot of the work. But that said, as someone, and speaking for myself, as someone who's seeking wisdom in these areas, as someone who's trying to see the interconnectedness of various issues related to justice and poverty, I also know how complicated these issues are. You know, if I'm honest, the more I research, the more I learn, the more I connect the dots, the wiser I become. The more and more my research and work feel like hevel. The more I learn about the complexity of issues of oppression and justice and what justice actually requires of us, the words of the teacher become visceral to me, that it's all meaningless. It's chasing after the wind. What is crooked cannot be straightened. I often feel overwhelmed by the complexity and my inability to understand the issues fully. I feel overwhelmed by how deep injustice runs and what is actually required for us to see meaningful change. I get overwhelmed by it, and it brings sorrow. And, you know, that's just one area of my life. But there's a variety of different ways that this plays out in our lives. I mean, think about your own life. You know, maybe for you, you've tried to be wise in how you deal with difficult relationships in your life. But as you've tried to be wise, as you've tried to learn about how best to interact with these difficult relationships, the complexities of those difficult relationships make it seem impossible to navigate. And as a result, it leads to sorrow. Or maybe you've tried, if you're a parent here, you've tried as best you can to parent your children well. You've tried to be wise in the ways that you raise your children. But even though, as you look back, you can think on many things that you got right, the more you learn about what it means to be a wise parent, the more you realize there have been, for all the good things that you've done, there are innumerable ways that you have gotten it wrong. And the more you learn, the more you feel the burden of those failures. Or maybe for some, you want to be wise with your health. And maybe in particular, you want to be wise in how you deal with a recent health diagnosis that's really complicated. And so you spend the time to be wise and trying to understand the complexities of what's going on in your body. But as a result of that work, trying to be wise and see the complexity, it doesn't lead to an assurance. It actually produces greater fear about what's to come. Or maybe you want to be wise in your finances. But the more time you spend trying to learn what it means to actually find financial security, the more you realize you might not ever achieve the kind of security that you desire. Or maybe for some, as you think about this crazy world that we live in right now, you want to be a wise person when you think about how to deal with the news and issues of politics. You really want to understand the complexities of everything that's going on. You do the work. You try to listen to everybody's arguments. You try to understand everyone's perspective. But in the pursuit of understanding that complexity, it doesn't produce hope in you. It actually creates this heavy-heartedness because you realize just how overwhelming it all can be. Wisdom is an attempt at taking the complexity of life seriously. But in doing that, sometimes it can be too much. In all of these circumstances and many more, sometimes it just feels like ignorance would have been bliss. It would have been better to have not even pursued any of this knowledge at all. Now here's the bottom line that we need to wrestle with. On the one hand, we cannot live as fools. We cannot live refusing to see the interconnectedness of life, because to live as a fool is destructive. It does not produce anything beautiful. And so living as a fool is not an option. But on the other hand, an honest pursuit of wisdom can leave us debilitated and overwhelmed by the complexities of life, because we are finite creatures who cannot understand all that needs to be understood. And the more we learn, the more we will realize just how limited and fragile and ignorant we are forever destined to be. So if foolishness is not the answer, but wisdom is so limiting and overwhelming, what are we to do? Well, I started off by saying that those limits, that limitation, is actually a gift. That limitation is actually driving us towards something that is a profound comfort if we would allow it to be. It's ultimately driving us toward the person of wisdom. I'll explain to you what I mean. One of the unique features of the book of Ecclesiastes is that it's the only book that is written from a secular perspective, meaning the teacher is making a case about life without God at the center. And that's why he focuses about everything that's happening under the sun. It's assuming, the book is assuming that God does not exist. And so in that way, it's a secular book. The book asks these probing questions that force us to examine a lot of the underlying suppositions that we hold. And some have actually questioned over the centuries, some have actually questioned whether or not the book of Ecclesiastes should be in the Bible, because it doesn't actually give you any answers to any of the questions that it poses. Others have said, well, the book of Ecclesiastes should actually be the first book of the Bible, because it's there where all the questions are posed, and then it's the rest of the Bible that answers the questions that are being presented. Because it's true, Ecclesiastes gives you no answers to the questions that it presents us with. All it does is it leaves you with a longing. But in that longing, it forces us to see the limitations that exist when we don't put God at the center of our understanding of the world and our lives. And that is also very much the case for the issue of wisdom. You know, you can be a person, let's frame it this way. You can be a person that experiences some measure of wisdom without believing in God. And that's very much been the case over the years. There are wise people, absolutely, who do not hold to any form of Christian faith. But there is a reason why Psalm 14 tells us that a fool says in his heart there is no God. And then maybe a little bit of a side note, but just to double click on that for a second. It's at least worth noting that there are two different ways that we can deny God. There's the obvious way where we literally say God does not exist. But there's also a functional denial of God that may be present amongst us, where we claim that God exists, but then we live and act as though he's not there. Either way, it's a denial of God. And either way, a fool says in his heart, there is no God. Why? Because it is foolish to assume that anything you give your life to in this world will provide you what you think it's going to provide. And it is foolish to assume that anything in this life matters when in the end, everything that matters most to you, everything you're giving your life for right now will be forgotten and lost one day. You know, there's a famous atheist philosopher named Bertrand Russell. He said something once on that topic about meaning and purpose, and I think about it all the time. I've used it numerous times at my church. But he said this, right? So frame it in mind with the things that matter most to you. This is what Bertrand Russell would say to you. That all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system. And that the whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins. He's right. If there is no God, nothing in your life ultimately matters. And it is foolishness to think otherwise. It's all hevel. But that tension, like we know things in our lives matter. We know that there is something more than just the inevitable collapse of the universe. That tension is the very tension that the teacher wants us to experience. Because when we realize it, we then realize we need something more than we could possibly attain if we were to make sense of our lives. And here's what I mean. And here's how the Bible answers the question about the tension. If you recall, the Apostle John in his gospel, in John 1, he says something fascinating that very much maps onto what we're talking about here. Famously, in the beginning chapters of his gospel, this is what John says. He says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made." And then he goes on in verse 14 to say that the Word became flesh and made his dwelling amongst us. What's going on there? Well, as you might know, the Greek word for that we translate as word is the word logos. And for the Greeks, the logos related to reason and meaning and truth. But for the Jewish people, the logos referred to wisdom. And it was a wisdom that existed before the creation of the world and which brought creation into existence. And in Jewish thinking, the logos was also represented by a person, which is why in Psalm 33, the author says that the heavens and the earth were made by the word of the Lord. In other words, the logos is the source and creator of wisdom. The logos is wisdom. And so if that's the case, who is this logos? Who is this person through whom all existence has come into being? Well, according to John, it's Jesus. See, Jesus is reason. He is meaning. He is truth. He is purpose. Jesus is wisdom. See, unlike other religious leaders and founders, Jesus didn't claim to simply know the way to wisdom. Jesus claimed to be wisdom. Jesus is not like the philosophers of our day who claim to understand wisdom. Rather, Jesus is the fullness of wisdom, and he was so before the creation of the world. It is through him all things were made. It is through him all things are sustained, and it is in him where true wisdom is found. And here's what that means for the hevel, the tension that we're struggling with. Jesus, who is wisdom itself, did not watch our foolishness from a distance. Jesus did not see the despair that we inevitably experience and keep himself at a distance. Instead, the Logos, the embodiment of reason and truth and wisdom, became flesh. And in doing so, he takes our frailty, he takes our futility, and he is born into a world of hevel. And he experiences our sorrow. And the fullest expression of that sorrow was the cross of Christ, which for the world looked like hevel. If you want to see an image of hevel, it is the Son of God hanging dead on a Roman cross. It looks meaningless, chasing after the wind. It's why in 1 Corinthians, Paul said that the cross was foolishness to the Gentiles. But the hope of the gospel is not just that Jesus died on a cross. If that's where the story ended, yes, Jesus hanging on a cross is hevel. It's meaningless. But he didn't just die. We also know that he rose again. The resurrection is actually the answer of all the questions asked by the teacher. When he asks, or when he says, what is crooked cannot be straightened, Jesus hears those words and in his resurrection declares what is crooked is being straightened, even death itself. What is broken is being made whole. What is lost is being found. The limits of wisdom that crush us are the very limits that Jesus takes upon himself so that as he rises again and as we trust in him, the resurrection power, the resurrection wisdom of Jesus is now ours. Here's outside of Jesus, all pursuits of wisdom will terminate into foolishness or despair. Because outside of Jesus, there is no possible way for us to transcend our limits. But with Jesus, all pursuits of wisdom are life-giving pursuits because we realize it is Jesus who first grants us an understanding of the interconnectedness of life. He is the author of life. So, of course, it is in him where we find the answers we long for. But it's also Jesus, as wisdom, to whom we can give the sorrow that we inevitably will experience. The meaninglessness of wisdom from an earthly perspective will always lead to despair. But the limitations that we experience now actually produce great joy for us because it's in those limitations that we come and lay those limitations down before Jesus, the one that we can trust. Ultimately, the limits of human wisdom need to drive us to rest in the source and the embodiment of wisdom, who is Jesus Christ. So what does that look like practically then for us? What does it mean to rest in Christ's wisdom rather than be foolish or be crushed by the limits of our wisdom? It means that you and I can pursue understanding the complexities of life. We can do the work of trying to be wise people without being destroyed by it, because we know the one who ultimately will resolve every tension we experience in that pursuit. It means if you're a parent in this room who, again, tried to be wise in how you've raised your child, and again, there maybe have been many things you got right, innumerable things that you have gotten wrong, and maybe you feel the burden of that reality, just know that because Jesus is wisdom and he takes our sorrow, we can trust that the work of the Spirit of Christ will do what you could not do as a parent. It's there you can find your rest. It means that the person who has studied injustice long enough to know how impossible it seems to overcome that injustice that exists amongst us, because of Jesus, you can still wake up every morning and do the hard work of justice because you know you're not the one that's going to accomplish ultimate justice. You can rest in the fact that Jesus will accomplish that ultimate justice. It means that the one who's struggling with the knowledge and the fear of that diagnosis, do the hard work of trying to understand what's going on in your body. But as you become overwhelmed by the complexity of what's taking place, find a hope and a rest in Jesus, who, yes, is ultimate wisdom, but who is also ultimate healing. You will be made whole one day. It means that for those that are overwhelmed by the state of affairs in our nation and in our world, as you try to pursue understanding about the complexity of all that's taking place here and all the nation states of the world that seem like they're constantly at war, it seems so overwhelming. Know that as you pursue knowledge and wisdom, you do not need to spiral into despair about what's happening amongst the nations of the world, because you can rest in the fact that your resurrected King sits on a throne and he rules over a kingdom that will never end. You can find rest there, even as you pursue the complexities of life. It means that the exhausted, grief-worn, wise person that the teacher is describing in verse 18 can lay down that grief, not by becoming foolish again, but by entrusting what they cannot carry, entrusting it to the one who is carrying it for us. Godly wisdom, friends, is trusting Jesus, the embodiment of that wisdom. If you want to be a wise person, make the work of Jesus the center point of your life. And even in the midst of the complexities that life will bring, you will find rest. Jesus is the answer to all of the hevel we experience in life. All the tensions you're going to experience over the course of this series, just remember, Jesus is the answer to every question that's going to be asked. I basically just summarized the entire series for you. Jesus is the answer to the hevel. Find rest in him.